In this lecture, we will be examining the changes in Southern agriculture in the decades after the end of the Civil War. We will also be studying the effects of these changes on the economy and culture of the South. Though labor systems changed, cotton continued to be the most important segment of the Southern agricultural sector. Sharecropping is an agricultural system in which landowners permit a tenant to farm the land in return for a share of the crop produced on the land. Typically in southern sharecropping systems, this represented about 50% of the harvested crop. However, in some cases, landowners took advantage of the fact that the sharecroppers were illiterate or semi-literate, and they drew up contracts calling for as much as 70% of the harvest to go to the landowner. Under the sharecropping system, these farmers borrowed tools, fertilizers, seeds, and other agricultural requirements from landowners. Sharecroppers would then pay off their accumulated debts to landowners, plus interest, by providing shares of the harvested crops. However, because landowners often included high interest rates, and they were also the principal custodians of the business records, sharecroppers typically sank further into debt every year. This map shows county by county the percentage of farms that operated under a sharecropping system at the end of the 19th century. The counties with the highest rates of sharecropping are in the bluish color, while counties with less than 20% of farms sharecropped are in that sort of salmon pinkish color. The states of South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Texas had the overall highest percentages of sharecropping farmers. There are a number of reasons why sharecropping emerged as an important component of labor needs for Southern agriculture after the Civil War. Slavery, of course, had been abolished, and landowners immediately lacked agricultural labor. The end to slavery in the South caused immediate distortions in labor demand. Freed slaves, of course, were no longer obligated by force or law to remain on the lands of their former owners, though a few did choose to stay out of some sense of loyalty or out of habit, especially older slaves. Landowners lacked the labor force necessary to plant and harvest crops by themselves. Small farmers, however, lacked sufficient capital to buy land and farm machinery. Large-scale land reform never really occurred in the South after the Civil War, despite the promises of General Sherman for 40 acres and a mule to freed slaves. Proposals to confiscate land from Southern plantation owners and then redistribute that land to former slaves failed to pass Congress. In addition, there were severe shortages of capital in the South after the war for many decades, as we touched on in an earlier discussion about the American economy after the Civil War. Southern landowners needed a workforce, and sharecropping filled that need. Almost all farmers became caught in a cycle of debt after the Civil War. Rural poverty became a norm for both free blacks and working-class whites. Merchants prospered, selling supplies to sharecroppers and loaning supplies and capital to landowners in an area of insufficient banking. The agricultural focus shifted away from food crops to more profitable cash crops, and therefore the South continued to import much of the food that was needed for human consumption because it wasn't as profitable as cash crops such as tobacco and cotton. The accompanying chart demonstrates the heavily southern nature of sharecropping. Very few farms, as you can see in the chart, outside the South adopted this system. In comparing sharecropping versus tenant farming, another labor system that emerged, tenant farmers rent land, but they own their individual tools. They're generally more independent in their economic activity, and they make their own decisions on what crops will be grown. That's a difference. Typically, tenant farmers enjoy a higher social status than sharecroppers, especially since their only obligation to landowners is to simply pay rent. In the South, in the late 19th century, African Americans were far more likely to be sharecroppers than tenant farmers while tenant farming was more likely to be engaged in by poor whites. This was not necessarily race-based, but I think it reflects more the fact that African Americans, as freed slaves, came into the market, so to speak, with less material wealth than their poor white counterparts who had been free before and scratching out a living on the land. However, despite a slightly higher social status, in many cases tenant farmers were just as poor as sharecroppers, and in some cases they had proportionally much higher debt loads. Another system that emerged after the Civil War, particularly in the South, is what is known as the Crop-Lien system, or Crop-Lien Economy. This allowed merchants and landlords who provided supplies to farmers to take mortgages on the harvests that these farmers intended to reap after the season, the growing season. Under this so-called Crop-Lien economy, merchants provided farmers with supplies on credit. Merchants then sold crops to wholesalers and or textile manufacturers in the case of cotton and flax. Merchants secured loans with a lien. This is a legal claim on the crops that will be grown next year by the farmers. Typically there were extremely high interest rates that also provided profit for merchants or whoever held the lien. Finally, many sharecroppers and tenant farmers, as we indicated earlier, were illiterate or semi-literate, and it was relatively easy to take advantage of them. This was also a time with very few consumer protection laws, so sharecroppers who had been defrauded by merchants or tenant farmers who had been defrauded by merchants or landowners really had no legal recourse. And frequently the judicial system at the time was rather corrupt, with influential people holding all the important positions, and at the same time likely holding many of the liens on the people who might have pursued legal action. The advantage to merchants and landowners was simple. The harvests could be seized if a debtor failed to repay loans, just like a home foreclosure in the present day. The image on this slide is from an 1890 Crop-Lien document, a summary of the debts. In this example, the farmer, who was an African-American man named Jesse Butler, owed debts to a North Carolina landowner named J.C. Miller. In the period from 1883 to 1890, on this document, the farmer's debt grew by approximately 30% over the 7-year period, and the annual interest rates and recording fee charges worked out to about 18% of the principal. Each year, the debt grew by an average of 13% over the amount that the farmer Jesse Butler paid in that time. We don't have any surviving records of what happened to Jesse Butler, but even in the best of years, the interest on Jesse Butler's debt exceeded the loan payments. Given the estimates of the cost of living and crop yields in the subsequent decades after this document was published, or was recorded rather, it was highly unlikely that Jesse Butler could have paid off this debt in his lifetime on the basis of harvested crops alone. To sum up the changes and the effects as a result of these changes, the sharecropping, tenant farmer, and crop-lien systems inhibited crop diversification and agricultural innovation, as impoverished farmers are very unlikely to take any risks given the meager potential for income they already have. Planters who were short on capital did not invest in new equipment or improve the land by such methods as crop rotation or contour plowing. Soil depletion and land erosion locked the South into a continual cycle of poverty as a region that in some ways it is still struggling to work out of even in the 21st century. Tenant farmers and sharecroppers became trapped in this cycle of debt peonage. They were technically free, but they remained indebted to landowners and merchants, and most states had laws at the time that either made it illegal to try to leave the area when a person owed money, or very, very difficult to leave the area when a person owed money. Even worse, tens of thousands of African Americans were arbitrarily arrested. They were levied with highly inflated fines and charged for the cost of their own incarceration if they became in this indebted system. With no means to pay these debts and accumulating new debts as a result of being debtors in prison, Prisoners were in effect sold as forced laborers to coal mines, to lumber yards, to brick yards, railroads, quarries, and sometimes on farm plantations. Government officials routinely leased falsely imprisoned blacks to small-town entrepreneurs, to provincial farmers, and even corporations looking for cheap labor. And this involuntary servitude system, based on debt rather than on skin color necessarily, although in effect it became another form of slavery many decades after the official abolition of American slavery. And this brings to a close our examination of post-war Southern agriculture.